QSO Today, episode 278, Denny Johnson, K5DCC, in the Digicomm Cafe. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you that they have just the right rig for contesters, DXers, and rag chewers. And by QRP Labs, my friend Hans Summer G0UPL's radio kit company, makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. This is an unusual episode of QSO Today because I was invited by Denny Johnson, K5DCC, to be his guest in his Digicomm Cafe, his nightly schmooze about ham radio that he publishes as his own podcast. Denny reached out to me because of his friendship with many hams here in Israel and his interest in QSO Today. So the format is off the rails. Denny and I are having a conversation over a cup of coffee about ham radio and the things that matter to us. And while it started out as his interviewing me, I was interested in what he was doing around his ham radio interests that parallel in years my own ham radio life. We touch upon some personal thoughts not often expressed on QSO Today. I hope that this is interesting listening to the QSO Today audience, and we'll be back on the regular programming next week. There are links to Denny's websites and the Digicomm Cafe at the top of this week's show notes page. K5DCC, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Denny?
Welcome, everybody, to the Digicomm Cafe. Come on in, pull up a chair around the table. We have with us our guest today, Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, who lives in Jerusalem.
Well, actually, I don't live in Jerusalem. I actually live about 8 miles south of Jerusalem.
Oh, really? Okay. I was looking at your QRZ page there, and it says that you are the founder of the Jerusalem Amateur Radio Society there in Jerusalem, Israel.
That's true. But Jerusalem has suburbs, and I live in one of the suburbs of Jerusalem.
Well, that's weird. You know, sometimes we have problems up here in the hill. We're out here in the sticks, so it's really touch and go. We have 4 meg down and 1 meg up, which should be enough. I see that you work with this amateur radio society there in Jerusalem and maintain some of the repeaters there. Are those all All-Star repeaters?
The analog repeaters in Israel are slowly converting to All-Star. I had the first All-Star repeater in Israel. I actually had the first All-Star node in Israel some years ago. You mentioned Rich 4X1DA earlier. He was the second to have an All-Star node. So I guess I kind of started this whole All-Star idea. The Israel Amateur Radio Club, which is like the ARRL of Israel, has kind of decided to use All-Star now to link the VHF repeaters together, which are analog, and then we're also putting in DMR on UHF across the country as well. And then all that's kind of linking together.
Very cool. I've been a fan of All-Star for, the last 12 years. And, of course, it's been fun to see all the developments and changes in bridging. I used to have a multi-mode system all linked together with All-Star, DMR, D-Star Fusion, Peanut, Ham Shack Hotline, TeamSpeak, and Zello. All connected together. But it was just too much. I don't think a lot of people appreciated the different bridging. My goal was to just try and bring everybody together instead of going off in faction groups.
Right, into the cafe.
Yes.
Just bring them into the cafe however they can get there.
Exactly. Radio or no radio, license or no license. We had things separated out for just VoIP for the non-hams to introduce them to ham radio, and I think you seem like you're kind of interested in the bridging too.
I like All-Star. We're doing some bridging in Israel right now between DMR and All-Star, and maybe it needs more processing power. It just doesn't sound great.
Yeah, well, DMR does have a different sound. I have an All-Star node in the cloud that is bridged to my DMR talk group on the TGIF network. And, of course, All-Star already has Echolink in it. And that was a problem I had. Echolink doesn't like bridging to the supposed non-ham platforms like Zello or TeamSpeak, so we had to break that off. We have several topics I thought we'd touch on. I know that you have had this wonderful interview that you had done by bringing someone else in, and I was just fascinated by that. So I won't belabor that. I would just encourage everybody to go to your website. I will actually have the link to that interview in the show notes for this conversation, and I highly encourage everybody to go and listen to it. You'll be very inspired. But in looking over your material and seeing your Facebook page and QRZ page, I see some interesting topics we could delve into. One of them being, I understand you're in theater.
I do amateur theater. There's an English theater company. It was started as the Gilbert and Sullivan Society of Jerusalem. It is now called Encore Educational Theater. Amateur, like Broadway, Gilbert and Sullivan. So they try to do Gilbert and Sullivan musical once a year, and then they'll do something else. I'm actually sitting out this fall. They're doing the Rothschilds, which is, I think, Sheldon and Harnach musical. So I'm sitting that one out in the fall, but I'm producing 3 musical evenings in the spring. The first one, January 21st in Jerusalem, where I sing with 3 other people.
Oh, you sing too?
I do.
Wonderful. My wife and I also sing. We had an album that we recorded, back in the mid-'80s, all original music my wife wrote. We called it Family Matters. It's all about family and marriage and faith.
I've started a thing last year called the American Songbook. So we like to take 1 or 2 of the composers each night. So last year we did Cole Porter and we did George and Ira Gershwin in 2 nights. And we go through their music and talk about some of their history and how relevant the music was at the time. And the one in January is Harold Arlen. Harold Arlen wrote Somewhere Over the Rainbow and Paper Moon and a number of songs like that. So 4 of us will sing 20 songs in an hour and a half, and hopefully everyone will enjoy it.
Is there a place where someone might be able to listen to that or watch it on maybe YouTube?
Well, that's a very good question. That raises some technical issues. You know what? If somebody records it, it'll be out on YouTube. I actually hadn't thought much about recording it. That's something we can figure out how to do.
It's amazing the ways you can record these things. In fact, we were at Silver Dollar City here last week, and I recorded a whole production of A Christmas Carol on my Apple Watch.
I would think your forearm would be kind of tired after.
Actually, I just turned it on and forgot about it and didn't worry about it, and it recorded it very well. And then I took it home and ran it through a program called, what is it here? It's Levelator. I don't know if you've heard of that before, but it kind of levels out all the...
You'll put that in your show notes page.
Yes. Well, actually, I put the whole episode in my podcast. I contacted Silver Dollar City for permission and things, so I shared that as kind of a Christmas treat. That was an episode from last week, because I was too busy at Silver Dollar City enjoying all the lights and the music and stuff. So, but anyway, that's exciting to hear what others are doing outside of ham radio, and I'm thrilled to hear that someone else is into music.
Well, I think you'd find a lot of hams are into music or into something other than just ham radio.
Oh, yeah. Do you play any instruments?
Like everyone else in the 60s and 70s, I attempted guitar.
Okay. Well, I play guitar and a little bit of mandolin.
You're much more serious than I am.
Well, I don't know about how serious I am. I haven't picked it up a whole lot lately. I've been more thrilled with amateur radio. In fact, as you talked about in your interview, I have Hovave radio intoxication.
That happens.
It does. You also touched on sometimes being too addicted to it, and I thought we might talk about that aspect of ham radio. How do you balance in your life with what you're doing with ham radio and podcasting?
So we could go back a little bit, and I'll give you some background on that issue. As a teenager, I was absolutely intoxicated by amateur radio. I kind of lived and breathed it. And the problem, I think, with that is we talk about balance later on, but I got to the point where it seemed to be, as I hit my early 20s, that I was beginning to make decisions professionally or about my schooling and things like this around ham radio interests. And I began to also meet a lot of hams who were much older, who had made amateur radio their only choice. And so it caused me to kind of bail out of amateur radio for a while. I didn't play a big part. I ended up going to college. I ended up coming to Israel and meeting my wife and heading back and starting a family. So I was actually out of amateur radio actively for almost 25 years before coming back. And I think part of that was too much amateur radio. So the balance is really important. It's a great hobby. It's terrific for the retirees as well as young people. It opens doors for young people, but it should be put in balance with the other things that are important.
Yep, and that can be a challenge. Now, as you probably have seen looking over the cafe, we say that we're located at the intersection of faith and technology. And so we do have an emphasis on faith in our group from whatever persuasion. I have an appreciation for yours. We've been involved in the Messianic Jewish movement, realizing that as a Christian growing up, we were robbed of our Jewish heritage And so we've learned a tremendous amount of things about the Jewish faith and embrace it. We love Israel. We love the people of Israel. And I sense that the Jewish faith is very important to you and probably plays a role in your balance act with ham radio and other things in your life, doesn't it?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I happen to be an Orthodox Jew, which means I keep the Sabbath every Saturday. I eat only kosher food. It makes traveling in America difficult, only from the standpoint that there's usually nothing to eat. I don't eat in restaurants that aren't supervised kosher. So, yeah, it does play a big part, and it's also one of the reasons that I'm living in Israel is that for the first time in 2,000 years, the Jews have a homeland again. I kind of felt that I could watch the game from America sitting in the bleachers, or I could be here and play on the field. So living here and playing on the field actually seems to create a great deal of meaning for me and my wife and our family here. So that's kind of the reason I'm here. I think contributing to the economy by running a business and employing people is one of the ways to kind of rebuild our Jewish connection to the land here.
Wonderful. Well, we support you in more ways than just praying for the peace of Jerusalem. I mean, we also consider ourselves Sabbatarians. We observe the Jewish Sabbath, sundown to sundown. We like to have Sabbath meals with our family. We celebrate the Jewish festivals, and it really helps us to relate more to the struggles in the life of our Jewish master, Yeshua. And we just love the color and the I don't know how to describe it to someone who's not familiar with it, but the traditions of Judaism are rich and really help us to understand the Bible in a more accurate way. And so we have a deep appreciation for the people of Israel. And when I found out about you, I thought, oh, great. I love this. I have many Jewish friends, and I love them, and we have a great fellowship. So I appreciate that about you, too. Now, back to getting into the hobby. You talked about being mentored by a neighbor. Mentoring is very important, or as some people like to use it in ham radio, being elmered, which there's a discussion about that word in itself. But tell us a little bit more about what you feel about mentoring and what it's meant to you.
If you listen to the QSO Today podcast, which is my podcast, I've put up 277 episodes already. Almost all those episodes begin with an interest as a child in electricity, electronics, and radio, shortwave listening, or something like that. I had an interest in electronics as a kid. My parents didn't share that interest, and my father didn't share that interest in electronics. So I happened to be in the garage with my dad. My dad loved cars, so his hobby was cars growing up, and I was in the garage one night holding the light. A neighbor who just moved in at the end of the building was putting in a garage door opener, wanted to borrow a tool. And I thought at the time nobody had garage door openers. That was pretty rare. So I thought that was kind of cool. I'd go over there and see what he was doing. And he was building a Heathkit garage door opener at the time. And Heathkit was a very large, for the younger people, Heathkit was a very large company in the 60s and 70s that was making electronic devices, amateur radio gear. They even made a mini bike for a period of time, television sets, stereos, all that stuff, test equipment. Here was this guy at the end of the street who had an interest in electronics, and he happened to also be a ham radio operator. It was very important, I think, becoming a ham and getting my license and then going to ham radio clubs and stuff and having people, adults, kind of supervising my electronic activity. And I remember one night at the Newport Amateur Radio Society in Southern California, I was asked to do the next meeting's presentation. There was a ham there, Rick Nelson, WV6OBM. I have no idea where he is now. I haven't seen him in 40 years. But Rick said, I'll do that with you, Eric. And he was an engineer, electronic engineer for a company in Orange County. He said, let's do this. Let's build a circuit like a code practice oscillator, but let's do it from scratch, and we'll actually etch the boards. We'll design the boards. We'll etch the boards in the club. We'll solder it and put the whole thing together, and we'll do it in an hour. I said, well, that's a great idea. So working with Rich, preparing the presentation for the club meeting, I learned an awful lot. I learned how to buy ferric chloride and put it in a glass cake pan and use it in the garage. My parents never noticed that the bottom of their cars were rusting because of the ferric chloride, but I learned a lot from my adult ham mentors. and they played a very important part in my electronic development and the way that I think about technology. Now, you mentioned earlier, I think maybe before we started, that the young hams don't want to necessarily hear conversations about old technology, old ham radio technology. But I have to tell you, I spent a lot of years as a teenager just listening on 2 meters or UHF on the local repeaters, and at that time every repeater in Los Angeles was busy and all the time, listening to people talk about what they were doing, about the antennas they were building and about the radios that they were tuning up, issues they were having, would be discussing about amongst each other, and I learned an awful lot about technology just listening to other hams talking. And now this message from ICOM America. Wish it, wrap it, gift it. These are the code words to your XYL or significant other to get the holiday gift of an ICOM transceiver to meet your ham radio goals in the coming year. ICOM offers a variety of high-performance and innovative products, so make the most of the holiday season with one of these ICOMs today. 'Tis the season to give your favorite ham the SDR they really want, and that's the ICOM IC7610. This high-performance SDR has the ability to pick out the faintest of signals even in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio, or SDR, that will change the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. It is exactly the right rig for DXing, contesting, and rag chewing. Its features include RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receivers allowing you to listen in 2 places at once, and dual Digicell. The ICOM IC7300 has changed the definition of an entry-level HF transceiver. This compact footprint also includes RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, a large 4.3-inch touchscreen, and a real-time spectrum scope or pan adapter. I have the IC7300 in my ham shack and love being able to see the activity in the bands as I'm tuning. Finally, the IC9700 is ICOM's latest entry in the VHF and UHF amateur transceiver market. The IC9700 should be at the top of every ham's wish list this holiday season, especially if EME or moon bounce or meteor scatter operation will be one of your New Year's resolutions. This all-mode transceiver works in the 2-meter, 70-centimeter, and 23-centimeter bands. Keep your competitive contesting edge with the faster processors, higher input gain, higher display resolution, and a cleaner signal. ICOM IC9700 is the pinnacle of perfection. Features include a 4.3-inch touchscreen color TFT LCD display, dual watch operation and full duplex operation in satellite mode, real-time high-spectrum scope and waterfall display, voice recording playback function with an SD memory card, and it has the same form factor as the IC7300 and will look beautiful next to any of your new ICOM rigs. Wish it, wrap it, and gift it are the code words that I opened this message from ICOM. However, if subtle hints or leaving ham magazines open to full-page ICOM ads does not seem to have the desired effect on your XYL, then just tell her that you are pining after a new ICOM rig and that you know where the nearest ICOM dealer is near you, and you will be happy to save her the trouble of wrapping it and gifting it. And when you buy that new ICOM holiday rig, be sure to tell your ICOM dealer that you heard it here on the QSO Today podcast. Fa la 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 la. And now back to our program.
And it sounds like all this has impacted your career choices too, huh?
I'm sitting in my home office, which on one side is the computer and the podcast recording center. It's the desk that I work on most of the day. And behind me is my ham station, but to the right of that is my test bench. And I've got a HP spectrum analyzer, network analyzer. It's a service monitor. It's used for two-way radio, but it works from 10 kilohertz to 1 gigahertz, so it will cover all of the HF band as well. I've got my 500 megahertz 4-channel digital oscilloscope. I've got hot air tools as well as regular soldering stuff. So yeah, I like to build stuff. I like to fix stuff. I think I like to fix stuff first. I never did it for a living because I don't think I could have made a living and paid for all the extras that we seem to need to have when we're raising children. But I love sitting at my bench and working on things.
Oh, that's cool. I remember building my first Heathkit station, SB102, SB200, linear, 630 station console, Kier, and I did it all in 3 days. I was afraid to turn it on I didn't sleep. I mean, when I turned it on, I just prayed, oh, hope it runs, no smoke. And it ran. But that was a thrilling experience.
When was that?
Oh, that was back in 1974, I think. I've been a ham for 50 years now, so done a lot. And like you, I got out of it for a period too, and really got enmeshed in the whole internet thing when our oldest son was going to college and told us about this thing called email. I started out with Gopher and watched it develop into Netscape, and been heavily into that internet stuff ever since. And then, of course, ham radio just fit in perfect with it, and it just dovetails so well now.
Were you always active as a ham?
Pretty much. I got my license in high school as a result of mentoring from an electronics instructor. In fact, he offered us extra credit if we would get our novice license, and they had a club station that we could use. So half a dozen of us got our novice ticket. My first station was a homebrew breadboard transmitter and an old SX24 Hallicrafters receiver. And those first contacts on 40 meters just lit up my life. I've been hooked on it ever since. I'd hate to think of how much money I've put into the black hole of radio gear over the years.
No, you never can. You never can do that. You can't say how much money you've spent. I think every ham has spent a lot of money on equipment, some that doesn't work. I've got a whole attic full of stuff that my wife doesn't even know about.
So your wife is not a ham?
No, my wife is not a ham. But most of the stuff that's in the attic is, I'm a collector. So as I'm walking the dogs in the morning, people throw out really good stuff. And so if it's a good piece of aluminum or a threaded rod or whatever it is they're throwing out, if it looks like it might have a ham radio use, it either goes into the area between the houses that nobody can see, or it goes up into the attic.
I'm starting to get that way, too. I just had some guy contact me here last month. Said, we got 3 old radios here we want to get rid of. Is it something you'd be interested in? His girlfriend's husband died, and I said, I'll be right over. Out of that, I got a beautiful Panasonic RF4900. Cleaned it up a little bit, and it's like good as new. That's sitting on my shelf here. But I got a couple of older ones there that look pretty tough shape. You might like them. You want me to ship them to you?
No, please don't. I found on one of the walks, they make these patio chairs that are canvas and then 2 1-meter diameter aluminum loops or hoops. There's some fancy plastic joints that holds the whole thing together. I'm looking at them, I'm thinking, this is a magnetic loop antenna. Actually, it's 2 magnetic loop antennas. So I found 2 of those patio chairs. So on the side of the house, I've got 2 of those. And at some point, one of those is going to become a magnetic loop receive antenna. I've got the broadband preamp already. I just need to build the rest of the system to kind of blow all that stuff into the back of the 7300.
Well, you sound like a troubleshooter. In fact, one of the things I noticed on your podcast site had to do with solar panel noise. You know, I'm kind of into solar stuff here, too. And I don't remember when I ran into this problem on HF, but my noise level is like an S9, and I thought, could that be solar noise?
Sure, it could be. Yeah, you could have a problem with the charge controller. Charge controllers on solar happen to, depending upon where they're made and who makes them, can be very noisy. The way that they're done here is, and I don't know a lot about solar panels. I don't have any because they make too much noise. But one of my friends who happens to be a ham at the other end of the town that I'm in has solar panels on his roof, and his noise level is outstanding.
Well, I was very tickled to run across that bit of information because I've been frustrated with my S9 noise level. And what I've got is not sophisticated at all. It's just one solar panel going to a cheap Chinese charge controller.
That's probably what's making the noise is the charge controller.
Yep, it's in our little storm shelter for tornadoes. And where is it located? Right underneath my long wire antenna.
There you go.
That probably takes care of that. I'm going to have to do that as soon as we're done with this podcast. Now, let's talk about your main passion right now, and that's your podcast. How did you come about deciding to do this podcast? And tell me a little bit about the struggles of developing it, building interest in it, growing your audience. I can learn a lot from you.
I'm a podcast listener first. So I think that every podcaster starts as a podcast listener. One of my favorite podcast networks is Leo Laporte's Twit network. That's twit.tv. He has all kinds of podcasts that are based on technology. So if you're a technology lover, then twit.tv network has all kinds of podcasts. I started listening there. Those were my first podcasts. And then I started listening to other podcasters and thought, you know what, I think what's missing is we need something for ham radio. And about that time, Ham Nation started on the Twit network. They were telling a story, and I thought, you know what, maybe I should tell a different story. Therefore, I decided to start telling the story of people who were old enough to be my Elmers. And that would be, and since I'm 62 now, those people would be people who were in their 70s, because most of my Elmers they weren't older, a lot older. They happened to be 10 to 15 years older than me. In my late teens, I actually worked for Communication Specialist, which was a company that made PL tone boards for the two-way radio industry. Spence Porter, WA6TPR, was a mentor. Mike Klein, WA6VLD, worked on the bench next to me, and he was an amazing mentor to me. So I decided that these guys are right now in their mid-70s, so what I'll do is I'll just find all of these hams that are doing outstanding things. They're focused on, as we talked a little bit earlier, on that one thing that they do really well, and I would interview them. And so that's kind of the idea for it came from Ham Nation doing their thing in the way they're doing it, and then what I do is I tell ham radio stories from the very beginning. So that's kind of been my focus. I tend to not take guests who are outside of that focus. So an example, somebody, Timothy, that you mentioned earlier, mentioned to me last night that I should interview the kids from Yacht, the young kids. I said, you know what, there's a lot of people that are interviewing them, and you have, from what I can see, a number of times. They're not my audience. They're probably adorable, but my audience is 50-year-old guys, mostly licensed over 30 years, have the extra class license, the majority of them, the majority over 50, as I just said. So I know my audience, and I know which stories I'm telling, and that's why I stay focused on that. And so if I was going to give advice for podcasters, I'd say that the most important thing is to stay focused, to maintain a structure that you present to your audience every week so that it's not new every week. Technology was not much of a struggle for me, because what I started was I would record on a program called Pamela using Skype, and I was using an old operator's headset for the first 100 episodes. So I didn't concentrate on technology, I concentrated on content. So I would say that that's the key advice for anybody wanting to start a podcast, is to concentrate on content, and all the other stuff will fall into place.
You have good content, and you have a very clear focus. It is evident in your podcast. I've been very focused on my goal, too, and I think it's important to establish a goal up front and stick to that mission statement or vision statement. And so mine has always been to build interest in the amateur radio hobby. And like you, I like to interview some of the older folks and have them share their stories and what they're passionate about now, what their concerns are for the hobby. We have interviewed several of those folks on Ham Nation, and we have interviewed people like yourself that are more well-known, right down to people who are feeling like they're just nobody. But I always tell them, everyone has a story. And in fact, I've been in the marketing business for a number of years, too, and that's always been kind of my tag for that, too, helping you tell your story. And it's amazing, the stories that people have out there. And so that's what I focus on, is having people tell their stories with the goal of building interest in the amateur radio hobby, which I love passionately. Now, in terms of growing your podcast, do you actually have any accurate numbers of how many people listen to your podcast?
The short answer is yes. I know the number of downloads that I get per episode, and that I get monthly. I won't tell you the number, because I think that it's not important, unless you're like Tim Ferriss, where you've had 400 million downloads in the last couple of years that you've done your podcast. But what it appears from my numbers is that new listeners, and I get new listeners. Well, let's put it this way. I have the same amount of downloads every episode that I've had for the last 4 years or so, 5 years or so, but it increments up very slowly per episode. But all of those incremental new listeners are going back and downloading the entire catalog. So now that's 277 episodes, and I can see that the monthly total is going up, but the individual episode totals are kind of incrementing up slowly.
Yeah, I never really got into the download side of podcasting because it takes up so much space on my device, which I primarily use my iPhone. And so I just stream it. Do you find most people streaming versus downloading?
Well, I use a company called Libsyn, and Libsyn gives me stats. So the stats tell me who are using browsers. I know who's downloading from my website, but I also see who's downloading from apps like Stitcher, for example. There's a whole bunch of apps that are on smartphones. Apps are great for listening to podcasts because apps will download the episodes so that you can listen to them offline, for example, or in the car, but they'll also update as new episodes come out. So the Stitcher app on my phone, every time a new podcast that I'm listening to or I'm following is updated, then it updates on my phone so that I'm carrying it around. So I just got back from the States and I was able to listen to many of my podcasts on the airplane without having to be connected to the internet. So for portability standpoint, listening using an app on your smartphone is a great way to listen to podcasts.
Right. Of course, you could set it up to automatically delete after the last three, I believe.
Or the last one. So as it updates to the next episode, then it deletes the one that's previous. Now, you can always go back and get them with the app and listen to them again, and so it'll just download it again. Yeah, apps are a great way to listen to podcasts. Surprisingly, I find I have a large percentage of my audience that listen to me from the link on the website, which is interesting. It means that they're not necessarily moving around. They're maybe they're at their desk listening to the podcast while they're doing something else.
Now, you mentioned Stitcher. Is that your favorite podcast platform?
I think Stitcher is my favorite podcast platform because I've only used it. I haven't tried anything else. It seems to meet all of my needs. There may be some others out that are better. If it works for me, I'm just going to stick with it.
I've just switched over to Anchor.fm from SoundCloud because it allows me to create segments of a podcast that I can rearrange. I can add music to or do transitions, all kinds of stuff. And it's now been bought out by Spotify, which is also a great way to listen. But Stitcher has some very cool features I just ran across. I don't know if you're aware of it. You can listen to my podcast on Alexa. Whoop, I got to turn her off. She's going to respond. I have a podcast skill called Radio on the Rocks, and you can just ask her to play that. But I just found out this last week that Stitcher has extra commands where you can actually rewind and fast forward a specified amount of time. So just with the power of voice, you could listen to your podcast, which is on Stitcher, just with voice command. And if you want to jump ahead or rewind and listen to something you missed, that's another great feature that Stitcher has.
Yeah, I think it's probably pretty common to most of podcast apps. I listen to my podcast at 2 times speed, and Stitcher allows you to listen at 2 times speed without changing the pitch and timbre of the voice. So it just sounds like people are talking faster. When people get in my car, a lot of people hitchhike in Israel. If I pick up a hitchhiker that's going into Jerusalem and they hear Stitcher playing on my car radio at 2 times speed in English, they'll ask me if that's English that they're listening to because they're not used to hearing English at that speed. It's kind of funny.
It's kind of like those commercials you hear where they have all the extra information they have to squeeze in there and they just rattle off so fast you can hardly understand it.
What's interesting is I have a blind friend, Steve, WB6FZU, who is a technology specialist for, I think, the Orange County Federation of the Blind. And Steve listens to his emails at 6 times speed. The brain is capable, with some practice, of listening at faster speeds. I like 2 times speed because I can listen to more podcasts, and I listen to podcasts while I'm driving and walking the dogs. I can get maybe 20 podcasts in a week. Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO Today.
So I take it you don't watch TV much?
I don't hardly watch TV at all. But when I do watch TV, I have an Apple TV, an old Apple TV with Netflix. And so Netflix is, I think, the only thing that we're paying for. And occasionally there's something there that's interesting.
Like Ham Nation.
I don't think they're on Netflix, but I think Ham Nation actually has an Apple TV channel, so you can actually watch Ham Nation or the Twit TV network on the video side of it. I've never seen the video side of Ham Nation. I listen to it as an audio podcast.
I have an Apple TV and a Roku, and I listen to the Ham Nation on Twit, which is just kind of as is. So you get the intros, you get them testing out their mics, you get some of the offhanded comments before they get into the actual unedited show. It's quite entertaining. One of the things that we do here is mesh networking. In fact, in my podcast, daily podcast, I call this Mesh Mondays. I wonder if you might, by chance, be into mesh networking.
I would love to be into mesh networking. I've got some Ubiquiti equipment in the drawer next to me. We actually think that we're going to probably use amateur microwave using Ubiquiti or MikroTik equipment in order to link the radio sites together at some point. Right now we're using LTE on some of the sites that are more remote. But I think, mesh networking is a great idea. I love the idea of mesh networking. The only thing is that you really have to get a whole bunch of people to buy in order to build that mesh out, right?
Yeah. Well, I found it very interesting here a year or so ago. I created a mesh network for my neighborhood. I had Linksys 54G routers with a SIP phone, Grandstream SIP phone for a total of $80. I set up one of them with a Raspberry Pi as a free PBX.
Right.
Then I went to my neighbors and I said, how would you guys like to be part of my mesh network for our own private phone system? Every one of them. Oh, you bet. Popped $80. I ordered their gear, provisioned their firmware on it, and set it up in their homes. So we have a off-grid communications network here with my neighbors who are not licensed hams, but they're starting to get a little flavor of what we can do for the community. And it works phenomenally well. I got a Ubiquiti bullet antenna up front, and I say, if anybody can see that, you can be part of our network. And even if you can't, we could create something in between. You could probably be connected through someone else you can see. And it works very well. So I met Mike, N9MS. I wonder if that has anything to do with mesh. But anyway, Mike's from Wisconsin. He's there now for Thanksgiving, and he lives in Arizona. And he's really big on the mesh networking, so he's our normal guest for that. Now we're talking about services you can add to a mesh network. And that would be cool to be able to have your radio network on there, too, to expand its reach.
Amateur radio connected by the Internet. I say this on the podcast all the time, that you need $1 trillion worth of infrastructure in order to be able to connect your All-Star node to other All-Star nodes, especially outside of the country that you're living in. So I love the idea of mesh networking between repeater sites. Maybe you're not using the mesh technology for this kind, but you're using microwave anyway between the sites, and then having the mesh networking coming down off the sites to local users. I love the idea. I love the idea of putting an asterisk PBX on it as a way to create another kind of communications mode on ham radio. I love that idea. I love the idea of using the mesh network for sending video or data or plans for things you're building or whatever you're sharing. I think the whole idea is great. And the fact is we have some amazing frequency bands in amateur radio for mesh networking that if we don't use them, they're prime territory for 5G or for any of the other services that the carriers would like to take.
Yep. Well, Mike is into tunneling too, which then he'll have a private mesh network in one location using the internet to tunnel to his other private mesh network back in Wisconsin. And so we're going to be getting into that in the future too. It'd be neat to get a bunch of these mesh networks tunneled together, well, much like we do on All-Star, I guess. I mean, you would just connect, and whoever's connected to your node is part of the network. I love All-Star.
Yeah, no, I do too. Well, Denny, I think what you did with your neighborhood is absolutely fantastic. What a great idea that is. You'll inspire a whole bunch of people to think about doing something like that. Actually, you have me inspired, because this ubiquity stuff now is not expensive at all, and the ability to create an off-grid separate telephone system for the neighborhood is an outstanding idea. I'm glad that you mentioned it.
Yeah, we have a lot of preppers in our area. In fact, that's kind of sort of our mindset. Not very extreme, but wanting to be prepared for anything. So if the power goes down, if the communication services go down, a mesh network makes a lot of sense for staying in touch with your community. And we're all rather separated. We have large acreages. I mean, I can see neighbors pretty easily, but most of us have anywhere from 10 to 30 acres of land between us. And this makes a nice, secure community that nobody can drop in on. It's very private. If I decide to add the internet to it for maybe doing some tunneling, I would do that only with their permission. But yeah, it's a very cool technology, and again, just part of ham radio. In fact, using these Linksys 54G routers, if you're on the lower channels, you're actually on ham radio frequencies. And where else can a non-ham use a ham frequency to communicate but mesh networking?
It's a very clever idea. You could also use it for security cameras around your neighborhood then, opening and closing gates or monitoring traffic on your private roads. Seems like a win-win situation there.
Yeah, very cool. Well, are you into satellites at all?
There's a number of hams here in Israel who are getting on the new S-HAIL, was that Oscar 10 satellite, which is a geosynchronous satellite over Africa. It doesn't have a footprint in North America. It seems like it touches the east coast of Brazil a little bit before kind of the Atlantic Ocean, most of Asia, all the way out to, I think, to about India. That's looking very interesting. So if I'm going to get into satellites, probably I'm going to find an Elmer here who's already done it and probably build one of those satellites.
Oh, man, I'm jealous. That's the QO100. And that's, I think it's centered over North Africa, so it covers all of the UK and Africa and that whole region. What is it, 10 gigahertz or something?
It's 10 gigahertz down and like 2.8 up. And it's broadband. It's a transponder. So that means for people that aren't into satellites, it's taking a big piece of spectrum and repeating it on another big piece of spectrum so that whatever you put into it, CW, FT8, single sideband. Unfortunately, some people are using FM on it and wiping out the band, but whatever you put on it, then you're essentially repeating it and it's coming out on 10 gigahertz. It's a really cool idea. Preppers should love it. I'm assuming that at some point somebody will build a geosynchronous satellite for amateur radio use over North America.
I sure hope so. I think that would be the coolest thing, where you could actually have a QSO instead of just call sign and grid square, although that's fun too. But most people like to chat and talk and get to know people. So I'm hoping and praying that'll happen someday.
The technology to do this S-HAIL satellite, that barrier to entry is what's probably keeping it nice and clean at the moment. But at some point, that barrier entry will lower and more people get on it, and it'll become a lot more crowded. But it's an interesting idea. It's an interesting idea, especially if you want to have a communication system that's off the grid. Here in Israel, we have cell phones that work everywhere from one end of the country to the other. But if there's a problem, public safety needs the cell telephone system, then all of a sudden that system stops working. So the idea of having amateur radio or having some other way to communicate is very appealing.
Yeah, and it takes money to do that. I understand QO100 was financed by some fairly wealthy individual over there in Saudi Arabia or
Qatar. It's Qatarian, yeah.
And I understand even our little birds up here, like AO91 and 92 that I like, cost almost $100,000 to put into space.
I believe that the Qatarian satellite also has commercial use on it. So it has an amateur radio transponder riding on it, but I think it has other use, and that's why it's sitting in a geosynchronous slot.
Okay, that's very interesting. Do you get into the HF digital modes much?
Only looking over the shoulder of people who are doing it.
So you've never done FT8?
No, I haven't. It looks interesting. For me, I think what's more interesting would be listening on Whisper and then reporting contacts that come through my receiver to one of the websites. It's more of a passive activity. I don't see myself spending a lot of time making digital contacts because it's not rag chewing, for example. You're just exchanging information, and I think if I'm just exchanging information to see how I'm propagating around the world, I think for me, Whisper might be more interesting.
Have you heard of JS8?
Is that the same as JS Call?
Yes, JS Call. It's based on FT8 technology, but it's for chatting. And not only that, it's a mesh network. It would be like packet communication. It's like on 20 meters, it would be 78 instead of 74. And you can do what they call a heartbeat to see who can hear you. And then you can also send a command to find out who they can hear. And so you could send a message to someone else, like I could send a message to you if you were able to hear somebody that was able to hear somebody that was able to hear somebody, like a mesh network. And we could actually chat back and forth.
And you do that in time slots like you do on FT8?
Yep, exactly like that. The application is very similar, but you have this window where you can type in whatever you want to type. And Jordan, the guy behind it, has increased the ability to transmit at higher speeds based on the strength of the signal. So you can get up to literally 25 words a minute CW speed in your conversations with someone that you can hear really well. Otherwise, it drops down, and it's all automated. So based on the signal strength, that determines the speed of the message passing. But it's basically a digital mesh network.
Now, you said that you're a prepper and that you're kind of, a lot of your neighbors are preppers. Do you have a bomb shelter and a year's worth of food?
No, we do have a lot of food stored up, but we don't have a bomb shelter per se, more a shelter for tornadoes. We do have tornadoes around here, and our home does not have a basement. So for safety, we thought the $10,000 investment was worthwhile. We've only used it a couple of times, but, what's the price of a life? So
Right. Do you have your mesh network down there and the ham radios?
I don't. But that is where I have a charger and a solar panel running where we could run lights or have a converter in there. And so we could run radios or whatever. But it would be a good place to do it. It wouldn't take much power to run a mesh system down there.
Especially since they're not so expensive, you could have a backup system there.
We also have backup power now with a home generator that we purchased a couple of years ago. So the chances of being without power are pretty slim now.
What kind of antenna farm do you have out there?
Simple as can be.
With all the property, you don't have beverage antennas running out in all different directions?
I'm kind of a minimalist. My antenna is the My Antennas 5-band end-fed long wire. It runs out like 130, 140 feet, and it tunes up beautifully on almost all bands. We have a tower. I actually put the tower in for a solar wind power generator. That lasted about a month till the first heavy windstorm came through and broke all the blades on it. So I gave up on that, went to solar. I had a repeater here that was running off grid with batteries and solar chargers that did well for several years, 4 or 5 years, till the batteries all died. And batteries are expensive, and I sold the repeater. Everything seems to be running towards internet-based things now, and so I've been really big on some of the VoIP technologies like you find on the International Radio Network. Zello, got several Zello channels in the Digicomm Cafe. Real big on the DV switch, folks, where I've got a Raspberry Pi here running DV switch server software, and a Thumb DV is plugged into that, so I can use my network radio. I've got an RT4.
Denny, what is Zello? I don't really know anything about Zello. What is Zello?
Zello is just a communications platform that utilizes the internet and people's cell devices. It's got a work side of it. They call it Zello Work. So let's say you had a business with several vehicles running around the country. You would set up their phones or their radios to connect to the same channel. It can be a private channel, unsearchable, and use it for communication, but you have to have cell coverage to do it. But it's wide open and free to anybody who wants to use it for whatever purpose.
So it's like a push-to-talk WhatsApp?
Exactly. One text, send images if you want, all kinds of control features on it. So there are many ham groups that use it for amateur radio bridging to other devices. That's what we had. We had a bridge from our Zello channel called Digicomm Cafe-Link, bridging to an all-star node, which then opened it up to Echolink, and using the DV switch software, we could bridge that then to D-Star, DMR, Fusion, all kinds of different things, including Peanut, which is another VoIP application that connects usually to a D-Star reflector. So we had that all going, and of course we had to give permissions, talk rights, for anyone to use that channel. And the Echolink folks, they just said that's not secure. Non-hams can use it. And we say it's no different than you. We go to QRZ. I just required people to respond to an email that I sent to their email address on QRZ. If they responded back, then I know that they are who they say they are, and I give them talk rights. If you can't do that, you have to know somebody who's a ham that can vouch for you, or you could come in through one of our other digital modes that you've already been validated for. So a lot of security in that, but it just makes it possible for people to join the fellowship with whatever device they've got, or no device at all other than a phone.
So do you have a push-to-talk internet walkie-talkie?
I do. That's my RT4. It's basically an Android phone running Android version 6.0 in an HD format. So I have a push-to-talk button, and I can run any application that you can find in the Play Store, Echolink, you name it, Zello, TeamSpeak. I have a Discord server. I can use that.
How would you use it with All-Star, for example?
Well, All-Star, using the DB Switch software, I can actually connect to any All-Star node out there. I set up an IAX account on my All-Star account, whether it's here at home or in the cloud. And from there, I have the ability to dial up whatever node I want.
You use the RT4 to connect to the DB Switch, and the DB Switch routes you into the All-Star node as a subscriber to the All-Star node.
Right. Much like you would do at Zoiper. Now, but the DB Switch server, though, allows you to get into a DMR network, D-Star, P25, NXDN, take your pick. It's all accessible through this one application that connects to your server.
And what do you use for servers for your DB Switch?
I just have a Raspberry Pi.
Really?
Yep.
It has enough horsepower to actually do the transcoding?
Yes. The only one that you need to transcode to D-Star would be the Thumb DV. You're familiar with that. Or 3000. That you can't do the transcoding for D-Star in software. It just sounds horrible. So they recommend plugging in this little thumb drive type thing, and that does all the transcoding. And when you've got it, it'll also transcode for DMR and does a much better job than software. But DB Switch Mobile, DB Switch Server, the software you install on an All-Star node just works phenomenally well.
Would you use the same Raspberry Pi for the All-Star node, or would you actually use a separate Raspberry Pi for the All-Star node?
I'd have my one All-Star node here runs on a Raspberry Pi. You can do it in the cloud. Probably the cloud is the most reliable.
You're not running DB Switch and All-Star on the same Raspberry Pi?
No, I do have those separate. I have several Raspberry Pis here. I've got probably 5 or 6. One is mostly for TGIF DMR. I've got one set up for Brandmeister. I've got a open spot for D-Star. I've got the server on another Raspberry Pi. I've got my PBX on another one. I mean,
you're running a Brandmeister server on a Raspberry Pi?
Nope, I just use the hotspot to connect to it. And I can do the same thing. I've got a Android TV box here that I have all this software on. And I connect that to my DB Switch server, which allows me to use my TV box to connect to Brandmeister, D-Star, all those other different ones, Fusion, YSF Fusion.
And what kind of internet service do you have out there in the sticks?
It's 4 meg down and 1 meg up. It's pretty slow compared to what most people are used to.
Well, it seems to be working just fine. Is it ADSL or is it a cable modem service? It's
DSL. If I look at my network setup here, I have probably over 20 devices connected to my network.
I too am running, I've got Raspberry Pis here. I'm using one to run as a All-Star node. Actually, all the All-Star repeaters we're doing now are running Raspberry Pis. We used to be using BeagleBone Black computers until the HamVoIP guys got it together and did it all on the Raspberry Pi 3. I've got an Asterisk PBX running for the house, and it works pretty cool. For a client, I just built a slideshow host, which is a very simple Raspberry Pi application to run a slideshow and video for them at a trade show. If anybody out there looking for Raspberry Pis, you can do all kinds of things with them.
And a lot of them are doing great things with even the little Pi Nanos.
Yeah, pretty amazing. My little hotspot came on a Pi Nano, I think. But I put it on a Raspberry Pi 3 because I actually like using network connectors and cables. My house has got Cat5 running throughout. That's pretty standard here. The house is made of cement and steel, so Wi-Fi isn't terrific in the house, and I prefer to be plugged in. So my hotspot is plugged in.
Now you talk about a house being made out of cement. Are you in the area where sometimes missiles get launched?
Look, the entire country of Israel is within range of missiles. The missiles that mostly come from Gaza are made of 4-inch sewer pipe, and that doesn't mean that they're not deadly. I mean, they've launched over 17,000 of those missiles from Gaza in the last 10 years or so. They do have Grad rockets. Grad rockets will reach here. Only a few times have they come this close, so all of our houses have bomb shelters.
I can't imagine living like that. And I really get mad when I see how the news is so one-sided. Oh, these poor guys, but Israel always gets blamed for defending themselves. It's just wrong.
Well, on the one hand, on the other hand, it doesn't keep us from going places and doing things. Every country has its challenges, I think. I've just come back from America, and it seems to me, the greatest country in the world, people don't seem to be happy, or the majority of people don't seem to be happy, or maybe I'm just running into the people that don't seem to be happy, but it's kind of hard to grasp.
I think it has to do with the faith element, and that's why we make that a part of who we are.
That may be it. Maybe there's people have lost their anchor. You probably want to edit this part of it out.
We're not going to edit any. This is what we're about. I've interviewed so many people that have been free to share their faith. There are some on the outside that say, oh, that shouldn't be part of ham radio. And I say, what? You're rejecting me? This is who I am. And I accept everyone as they are. And part of amateur radio is to build international goodwill. And how can we do that if we can't be who we are?
That's certainly true. I guess the only thing that surprised me on this trip was it seems to me that people should have more hope. And maybe that's a lack of historical perspective. I think that we live as human beings better now than we ever had in the history of humankind. It surprises me when there are so many people who are kind of down on the way things are right now. For the most part, it's pretty good, even here.
I think you hit the nail on the head, though. Many people don't have an anchor. And if we don't have our lives anchored in a kind and loving God, there's a lot of despair. There's a lot of depression. And that's part of what I want to bring to the hobby, too, because you see that in many circles in amateur radio. There's just a meanness out there and impatience and lack of tolerance. What I say here in the cafe is we want to be a place where we have a culture of kindness. And it's a place where we all learn to listen, acknowledge, and share. And what I mean by that is we respectfully listen to other people and their different views. We acknowledge that we hear them, and we share back where we're coming from in a very kind and respectful way, non-judgmental way. And I just won't tolerate any of the bickering and fighting and drama that you might find in other groups. And I find that a lot of hams are drawn to this. They want this culture of kindness again, as we so desperately need in the whole world. And for me, it comes from this being anchored in a kind and loving God.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. Let's say we use ham radio as a paradigm for life, for example. Now, I say this all the time, that ham radio is a big tent, meaning that it has a lot of technology, a lot of different kinds of technology, a lot of different activities, a lot of different kinds of activities, from working DX or working contests or traveling on DXpeditions or working satellites or building equipment or making the mesh networks. We've talked about all of that stuff, right? But I think the ham that does all of those things without mastering any of those things isn't satisfied. And so that's where I've said in the past, and I believe it sincerely, not just in ham radio, but in other aspects of life, that it really pays to focus on one thing for a while. That's most of the people I've interviewed. Hams that focus on one thing and learn to do it really well so that they become a master of it. They have a sense of satisfaction from the hobby that they wouldn't have if they were trying to do a little bit of everything. It's kind of like continually being distracted by social media every time you think you're about to go in deep on something. You create this frustration for yourself because you never finish what you start. And I think that ham radio is a paradigm for this. The most successful hams, the happiest hams, are the ones who've gone in really deep.
Well, I think it's very true. You need to focus. You seem like a very focused person, and over the last few days that we've been communicating about this conversation, I've been focusing on getting to know you better and building a friendship, and I really appreciate you taking your time to spend your evening with me here in the cafe, and it's been a good discourse.
And the coffee's good, Denny. I really appreciate the coffee in the cafe.
Well, that's good. Thank you. I invite you to join us on our All-Star Note. I don't know how much activity you find there. I know Rich says that it's pretty quiet most of the time. However, I have joined a net with, I think it's Mark and some of the guys.
Right, 4X1KS. We say it's a Sunday night net. For us, it's Sunday night at 9 o'clock, 42555 DMR. Yeah, we try to have a net there. But, the issue I think that we have, that everyone seems to have, and I like the idea that you've used DV Switch to build a kind of this way to bring a whole bunch of people together, and that is that there's so many hams now segmented on their own systems. How many All-Star nodes are there now? That unless they're connected together, you don't hear any activity. Even with, maybe there's 14 of us now on All-Star in Israel, between working and everything else we're doing, there's not a whole lot of activity. And so just to create noise, we'll turn on the WIN system, which is a great network net system on the west coast of the United States, which is over 90 full-time nodes connected. But even then, it's not as busy as 2-meter repeaters were 40 years ago. It's hard to find people to talk to on these networks unless they're connected together.
That brings up another question. What are your thoughts about the state of amateur radio today?
Oh, I love amateur radio today. It's a big tent. I said that earlier. It's a big tent. It has all kinds of distractions and shiny objects. I think that the Internet has made it possible. Oh, look, you and I are talking on Skype. But I think it's made it possible for us to innovate and share and move the meter faster than we've ever been able to do it. Think about it when you got into ham radio in the 70s, Denny, that if somebody had a technical idea or a technical innovation, they'd put it in QST or 73 or Ham Radio Magazine. It would take 4 to 5 months before that was published, and it would take another 4 to 5 months for someone to respond to it, to make that dialogue in order to innovate in that way. Now we do it instantly, and we broadcast instantly, and innovation or open source projects or whatever it is that we're doing in amateur radio, those things are happening by leaps and bounds literally overnight. So I think it's a great time to be a ham. I'm very optimistic about ham radio. I think, however, that the challenge is that we somehow need to come out, and maybe you've got the idea with your Digicomm Cafe, and as we need to come together every once in a while and have the conversations about ham radio and where it's going. I'm not worried necessarily about young kids coming in. I've said this on my podcast that 35-year-olds coming into the hobby with a life expectancy into the 80s means that there's a lot of hams that'll spend 50 years in ham radio before they move on to the next world. So I think ham radio is in great shape.
Can you imagine what it's going to look like in 50 years, much less 10 years?
On the one hand, I can't necessarily in terms of the technical innovation, but I think in 50 years you'll still have hams working CW and enjoying CW because of the intellectual stimulation that comes from it. I think we have more CW operators now on the air than ever in the history of ham radio. And I think that's because, I guess maybe there's some nostalgia for it on the one hand, but it's also a great activity to do after you spent your day being bombarded by telephone calls and social media and all the other stuff that seems to drive the noise in people's lives.
Well, I've started getting back into CW a little bit, but I don't hear nearly the activity I heard when I first got my novice license. It was wall to wall. You had to just use the filters to pick out the one conversation.
Wait till the sunspot cycle starts to come back up. I think a lot of people have gone to the digital modes and FT8 just as a way to keep communicating, but I think that when the sunspot cycle is back up, I think that you'll hear a lot more people on CW.
Yeah, I can't wait. I remember driving down the road with my realistic 10-meter mobile radio talking to people in Japan from Minneapolis like nobody's business. Those were the days.
They were the days, but they're coming back.
Well, you spent a whole hour and a half almost here with me in the cafe. I'm sure you're ready to move on to your podcast and line up your interviews. I know that your podcast is very formal and very well organized. I'm more of a free roller, very spontaneous. And so this has been hopefully relaxing for you to just not to worry about it, but just enjoy our conversation. I know I've enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. And you have a new fan.
Well, thank you, Denny. I'll start loading your podcast into my Stitcher and listening to what's happening in the cafe. How about that?
That sounds great. And please join us on All-Star. If you want to connect to us, I'll connect to you from time to time and give you a holler. We haven't talked to Rich for a while because, of course, different time elements here. We're right now, for me, it's 20 after 12, and for you, it's what, 8 o'clock, 8:30?
Right. As a group, we tend to be very busy doing a whole bunch of other things, including amateur radio. So we're being pulled in different directions, and we no longer wear the radios around all the time.
Yeah, that's for sure.
The cell phones have replaced the radios.
Yep, exactly. Well, stay radioactive, my friend, and appreciate the time we spent. This will be, like you say, up almost instantly on the podcast. Well, I'll wait till the end of the day. I have other things I need to add to it, other segments. But this has been a real joy and a pleasure. I'm honored to have you visit us here in the cafe.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
73.
4ZUG. This is K5DCC 73, my friend.
4Z1UG 73, Denny. That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Denny. Please be sure to check out the show notes, not much of them this week, that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K5DCC in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.